Babylon Revisited is a short story written by F. Scott Fitzgerald in 1931. As I think you probably already know, F. Scott Fitzgerald is one of America's greatest 20th century writers, and he did take experiences from his own life and based events in his novels and short stories on these events, and of course as well as the people he knew in real life, especially his wife, Zelda Sayre Fitzgerald, the character of Daisy Buchanan in in The Great Gatsby, right, was based on her. And then in this story, right, his dead wife Helen would be the closest thing that we would have. But he, just like Jay Gatsby, when he first meets Daisy, he feels like she's out of his league. She's so beautiful and she's upper class. And Fitzgerald felt that way about Zelda, but he does eventually marry her. They get married, and they have a daughter named Frances, but they call her Scotty. They live very well during the 1920s. Fitzgerald is writing all the time in order for them to have the money to live a luxurious lifestyle in New York City, to travel into European cities such as Paris, London, etc. And they also, of course, were part of the whole jazz age excess, with him drinking a lot, her drinking, but then her slipping into mental illness. And she finally had to be committed to a sanatorium, right, for treatment, and she was never able to actually come out and live a normal life again. So even though they are happy together for a short time as a family, it does not last very long. Again, just like in the story, right, they were not able to have Charlie and Helen and Honoria were not able to live happily for a long time. Fitzgerald, however, always had a close relationship with his daughter. He loved her very much. She loved him very much. He did not live to be an old man. His alcoholism did get the best of him. He died from complications of alcoholism. But that kind of has an echo from the story, where we can see that Charlie thinks that he has a handle on his alcoholism by drinking just one drink a day, so that it doesn't get too big in his imagination, and he feels like, right, that's a way that he can handle it. That's his strategy. However, the reader maybe wonders about that, if that could actually happen, because alcoholics don't usually or can't handle drinking at all. But in Fitzgerald's own life, we see similarities to what happens in this story. So he really did have a sister-in-law, Zelda's sister, Rosalind, who was married to Newman Smith, and he was a banker who was based in Brussels, Belgium. And the Smiths were not as well off as Scott and Zelda, just like the Peters, right, were not as well off as the Wells in this story. And Rosalind did blame him for Zelda's mental illness, and Rosalind wanted to adopt Scotty when Zelda was committed to a sanatorium in Switzerland. So maybe having his daughter really taken away and having a guardianship given to his sister-in-law was something that really concerned Fitzgerald enough that he was able to put it into a story, inspired him to put it into a story. And in fact, when he wrote Babylon Revisited in 1931, it was only 8 months after Zelda's breakdown. So again, those some of the emotions that are expressed in the story, the feeling, the loss, and regret, or maybe that's what he was experiencing himself at this time in his life. So the cultural milieu, obviously the story is set in Paris, France, in 1931, 2 years after the stock market crash. And then Americans who were living large during the boom years have lost everything. That's made apparent during his conversation with the bartender there at the Ritz. Even though Charlie has been able to get a good job again, many people were never able to recover what they had lost financially after the stock market crash. But during the 1920s, that was a time when Americans living in Paris spent money extravagantly, drank and partied, lived in the moment because they were disillusioned after World War I. And there's this idea that you get from the story that Americans really felt like they owned the city, right? As Americans and with money, they kind of felt that it was their right to take over. But of course, that didn't last for long. But World War I, maybe we can't see it now, but the fact that so many countries were involved, just the idea that the whole world could be involved in a war and there could be that much bloodshed and that much damage was something that it was hard for people who had seen the effects of it. It was hard for them to get over. But the Great Depression was a wake-up call for many, especially those who maybe felt like they had been wasting their lives, drinking and partying and thinking that was the way it was going to be forever. And if we think about the cultural milieu, the characters in this story, we have Charlie and Helen Wells, who were, a successful, glamorous couple, attractive. When they would go out, no doubt people would wish that they were, could be like them. And they had this, liberated values. Again, this was like one of the first times when women were getting to do all the things that had been forbidden in the past. They cut their hair off short. They smoked. They wore their skirts shorter. They danced the night away, even if they were in the U.S. and it was during Prohibition, and the bars were closed. They still were going to go and do those things that they thought were fun and would experience a freedom that they hadn't had in the past. But the jazz age, cost them dearly, and so Charlie was determined to change. Right? We see that, right? He thinks that the kind of people they had been in the past was not a good way to continue on into the future. It caused him to lose his wife, to lose his daughter, at least for a while. And then you have kind of the opposite of Charlie and Helen with Lincoln and Marion Peters, because they were just a struggling, average couple. They had to watch their expenses. They didn't even have enough money to invest in the stock market when it was doing so well. They had the traditional values of the home and the family and putting that first and not taking chances, right, that might put any of that in danger. And they weren't really affected then by those boom years. They didn't let their behavior change. They didn't have all of the money to spend. But they did have that feeling of envy or jealousy for some of that wealth that her sister and brother-in-law were experiencing. Then we have Duncan Schaeffer and Lorraine Quarles. And of course, they are that couple that would have been like Charlie and Helen during the 20s, but they have not learned anything from that. So they are still hanging on to the past and thinking that lifestyle of living large and drinking too much and being boisterous and not caring what other people think was the way to go. The narrative structure in this story, well, at the point of entry, We meet Charlie, learn he's in Paris, but a Paris that is very different than the one he knew previously. The inciting moment in this story happens very soon because it's when Charlie gives his brother-in-law's address to the bartender at the Ritz. So if he hadn't have given the address so that Duncan Schaefer could learn where the brother-in-law lived, they would never have been able to find him there, and so the things that happened would not have happened. The crisis in this story is that just as Charlie and Marion are coming to an understanding about Honoria, right? She's going to be leaving with him to go to Prague on the Saturday, right? Giving her enough time to get Honoria's things ready. But then Duncan and Lorraine show up drunk and make a scene, and she just as quickly changes her mind, horrified by their behavior, and then unwilling to give Honoria back to Charlie. So actually, I guess I jumped ahead there a minute, right? They show up, they make that scene, and then the climax is when she is then going up to bed, sick, and she won't allow Honoria to leave with her father. Finally, there is a denouement, a resolution, because Charlie goes after this back to the Ritz bar. He's looking for Duncan and Lorraine. He doesn't find them there. And so he actually has a conversation not just with the bartender, but with Paul, who is the one who is the manager of the bar. And in that conversation, Paul says, "I heard you lost a lot in the crash." And Charlie replies, "I did." And he added grimly, "But I lost everything I wanted in the boom." Selling short? Something like that. And so we know from this that he lost, of course, his wife. She died in the boom years. But he also lost his feeling of self-respect. Right? He had lost his honor. And that was something that was very hard for Charlie to regain. Right? He had the desire for it, but could he do it?